we are going to start our roundtable. We would prefer not to be in this table, in this side of the table, but in a really round table, architecturally speaking, but we don't have that room, that possibility. The microphones are attached to the table, so we need to be here. I'm going to start just to read the abstract, or so to speak, of the round table that is in the page 42 of your book of the Colóquio, and then I will ask our two keynote speakers, Kapil and to say something about what is their present interest in research, what they could write about if they needed to start to do today, or to write today, a paper or something like that. So the theme is, we make ourselves and our world in the making. But what do we learn about ways of making and their repercussions at the level of the individual subject or of the social collective when, instead of being considered as separated areas of action, we articulate, we entangle them with each other? What is the relation between making, learning, transmitting, building, dwelling, creating, memorizing, and understanding history, etc., when these activities are considered in intimate relation to each other, and all of them with human action in general embedded in the world? What are the possible relations between the experiences of anthropology, archaeology, art, and architecture? How do they help us in the understanding of the present moment of history? So this is the main guideline for us. I apologize because I forgot to say that in the table is also our friends and colleagues, Paula Montessancho, she talked yesterday, and Jorge we also expect Kapil, and there will be also Legal, but Legal could not be today with us. So we are all participants in this roundtable. As well as yourselves, we count very much on the assistance to raise questions, to mainly, I think, I may speak in name of the collective, the organizers. We think that this is a very good moment to hear in a more discontracted way these two authors that are beside me about their work. So I would ask Kapil, please, to tell us something about yourself, not, of course, your biography, because it is already known by the people, but what is your main interest in this moment, is, if possible, in relation with the theme of the roundtable, ways of making?
Yeah, well, this is a daunting question. So I will tell you a little bit about myself, and to translate what you said, what makes me tick? What is the clockwork that keeps me going? And through that, I'll try and relate to the themes of this workshop. In fact, ways of doing and ways of making. In English, there's a distinction which in French and in Portuguese is covered by Fazer. Whereas in English, we have two different things. One is to do and one is to make. And doing and making are not the same. They could be at times, but not always. So my question, in fact, has to do with this overlap also between doing and making. My problem, in fact, came to me slowly, and I couldn't put words to it. I couldn't actually express my problems till much, much later in life. My problem started when I was about in my early 20s, and I abandoned my university education. I was in my MSc final in mathematical physics, and a convinced, in fact, obsessive rationalist. I thought that the world was mathematical, and that people who did not understand the logic of mathematics couldn't understand the logic of the world or how the world was made, how things were done. And that if there was a problem in my country, that problem came from a lack of rational education and grounding in mathematics. Mathematics was my passion. And at the age of 18, in fact, that passion encountered another passion. At the age of 18, I was 18. At the age of 18, yes, I was 18, but at the age of 18, we were in 1968. 1968 was a world moment, where things were happening all over the world. Things were happening here, in Europe, and in the US, and they were happening in Asia with the American invasion of Vietnam. But they were also happening in China with the Cultural Revolution. And they were happening next door in India with the effects of the Cultural Revolution, of Maoism just next door, with years and years of experience and encounters, and the place of the Communist Party in the independence movement in India in its early years. And all this had led us, on the young students, young people, to re-question the basis and the optimism with which we all set out in this new independent India. Suddenly at the age of 18, you come to realize that the world is not quite the way it should be. And for me, what attracted me to Marxism was the fact that Marxism presented itself as a rational, materialistic, scientific philosophy of history, which tried to make sense of the world through rationalism, and gave us a teleology, a meaning of this, of how history, in fact, unfolded and where it was going. And so this reinforced my belief in mathematical rationality, and I went out to a village to teach as a Maoist, but to teach, not to make revolution directly, but to teach people how to read and write, to teach them mathematics and to teach them rationality, in the belief that they themselves would then become revolutionaries. Because that was the only way, it was rational. So it was like a mathematical proof. You give them the idea of the proof, and then they can prove whatever, and they see the light at the end of the tunnel, and they go that way. And unfortunately, things did not happen the way I expected them to. In fact, everyone was really hungry to learn how to read and write, to learn mathematics, but they refused my rationality. And this, of course, was a big shock to me. It came as a shock because in the beginning it was a refusal, but it came as an even bigger shock when, after 3 years or 2 years in the society, in a village in India, I suddenly began to be able to think like them. I could anticipate their objections. And this, for me, was a big shock, which meant that there was something systematic, that this was not arbitrary. Their responses were not this one day, something else another day, a third thing another day, but there was some sort of system. I could not call it rational. There was a system here. But I couldn't put words to this. I think I was a mathematician. I did not have this vocabulary that I have today. I couldn't articulate these things. And so slowly, when I came back, I went back to university and did philosophy, thinking that philosophy would give me the answers to these questions. And of course, philosophy did not give me answers. And it took me many, many years till I was almost in my late 30s that I began, in fact, to be able to give some sort of words, put words to the ideas that I had and know where I was going. And that was what I felt was in the history of, or in a kind of an anthropology, if you like. For me it was, I went into history, the history of science, to see how people who belong to different cultures can actually meet. My question also was, one of my fundamental questions was, I as an Indian was meeting other Indians. I have become something very different from the others. That means a part of the Indian population in contact with other cultures had actually appropriated a way of thinking which was not the way of thinking of people who lived in this village. How did these changes take place? Was this coercion? I didn't think so. It wasn't as if someone beat us into thinking another way. So there was a terrain of encounter, a terrain where something new was negotiated. Of course, when I came to Europe, I found that my rationality was not the rationality of my French colleagues, whose rationality was certainly not the rationality of my English colleagues or friends in England. That there were differences. And at the same time, there was something else that was going on which allowed for communication and allowed for people to actually do things together and to make sense. And things could be translated more or less meaningfully between cultures. And so this has been the theme of my work. So the theme of my work has been, ever since, the construction of knowledge, I put it, or of science, the construction of whatever that we do, that we make, through intercultural encounter. Now, these intercultural encounters can be geographically separated, they can be separated over thousands of kilometers, but they can also be separated socially within the same space. You can have people who have different sociabilities, who live in the same space and who have to communicate with each other. This, I realized, when reading, that this is the classic problem of 19th century sociology. Someone like Durkheim asks this question. For him, the main question, the founding question of sociology is, how, God damn it, do people manage to create consensus? This is the 19th century, when everything is exploding everywhere in Europe. How is consensus formed, nonetheless? How do societies function? And this is the basic question, and these are the questions that, for me, form. I didn't know this, I didn't read Durkheim to actually do this, but I found that these are questions that underlie a lot of the preoccupations of the classic social sciences before they got fragmented. And so this is what, for me, has meaning. And I look at this in the world of the encounter between South Asia and Europe from the 16th to the 21st century as to how these encounters take place and what changes take place and how these encounters get layered through, in the beginning, a situation which is not colonial into a situation which becomes colonial, which then goes into a post-colonial stage, and how these encounters actually fashion the way in which, in your vocabulary, Modos, Fazer, actually get founded in this context and how they change. So.
Thank you very much for the words. I think we all understood very clearly. And now I am going to give the microphone to Tim and go and ask him the same thing. You have made many retrospects of your own way, but please, if you can.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me here. I've just finished a 5-year project which was funded by the European Research Council, which was called Knowing from the Inside, or KFI, because with European money you always have to have an acronym, KFI. Anthropology.
It's not Kentucky Fried Chicken.
It's pretty close to Kentucky Fried Chicken. It's Kentucky Fried KFI. And it's very nice when people talk about, oh, you're KFI, it becomes a brand. There's Knowing from the Inside, anthropology, art, architecture, and design. And the underlying rationale for this project was to reconfigure our understanding of the relation between knowledge and the world we claim to know about, particularly in the arts and the humanities. We wanted to establish and to try out a procedure by which knowledge does not grow, does not emerge from engineering a confrontation between theories in the head and facts on the ground, but rather to show how knowledge grows out of a creative engagement with the world around us, that world including other people, of course, but also everything else. So we wanted to show how you can think, you can imagine, you can speculate through a working with materials, with things, with people, to show how knowledge actually grows out of that conversation. So that's what we've been doing in these particular areas of anthropology, art, architecture, and design. And commonly, these disciplines are imagined to point in different directions, so that most anthropologists tend to think of anthropology as fundamentally an ethnographic project, where the purpose is to try and find out how life is lived and experienced by particular people in particular places, to describe, to analyze, to write them up. As opposed to experimenting and speculating on what the future possibilities of life might be. And I want to try and turn anthropology around to make it an experimental and speculative discipline. So there's nothing wrong with ethnography, there's nothing wrong with making detailed and deep inquiries into how life is lived and experienced by people, but we also need to do anthropology, that is to think about what the possibilities and conditions of human life in the world might be. And that is to think of anthropology as a forward-looking discipline, thinking about the future and not just about the past. And that, I think, is where anthropology can join forces with the disciplines of architecture, of art and design, because they are also experimental, they're also speculative, they're also thinking about what the possibilities of life might be. So it was at that level in our project that we wanted to try and bring all these disciplines together as ways of thinking about experimental ways, speculative ways of thinking about future possibilities of life. And I believe that at this moment, we're in a rather critical moment, I think, in history, and the world is in many ways at a tipping point. And we all need to address the question of how we should live now so that there can be life for generations that follow us. And this seems to me to be the most important question of our time. And I see anthropology, which is my discipline, as a discipline that should be not simply learning about others and the ways they live, but fundamentally learning from others. And through that learning, thinking about what the possibilities of life and the conditions of life for us and for future generations might be for all of us. It's not just saying, well, they do things differently in this culture, we do things this way, they do things that way. We have to say, what can we learn from what they know about how we might, all of us, find a common way forward. And recently I wrote a book, published in March this year, in a very short book. It's called Anthropology, Why It Matters. And it was one of a series of books that is being produced for different disciplines in the arts, humanities and social sciences to show to a general readership why these arts and humanities and social science disciplines are really important. And in that book, I put forward a kind of manifesto for this kind of anthropology. An anthropology that starts from the question, how should we live? That, to me, is the fundamental question of anthropology, and it's what motivates my work. Victor asked me to say, well, what are you working on just now? And literally just now, that is yesterday and today, and for the next couple of days. I am in the middle of writing a very little essay, which was commissioned by a local arts organisation on shelter. I want to write about shelter and what shelter means. And I'm finding it both difficult and extremely interesting. Because in the commission to write this essay, the first statement was, shelter is a fundamental human need. And yes, we all need shelter, and we imagine our distant hunter-gatherer ancestors sheltering in a cave and so on. But then I thought to myself, I don't shelter in my own house. I mean, if somebody is homeless or in need of help, then I open my door to that person and they can come and take shelter in my house. But I'm not taking shelter, the guest is taking shelter. And I began to realize that this idea of shelter implies vulnerability, and therefore that it has a political dimension, and that the idea that our distant ancestors sheltered in caves was part of a Western, a dominant Western narrative, according to which our ancestors were very vulnerable. They were weak, they had poor technology, they were not in control of nature, so they had to take shelter in whatever nature could provide, a cave. But then gradually we became more and more superior, technologically sophisticated and so on, more powerful. So we are not taking shelter anymore, but we are creating inequalities such that people suffering from domestic abuse, homeless people, refugees, migrants are all looking for shelter. So I realized, first of all, that shelter, the idea of shelter, although we present it as some sort of basic human need, is fundamentally political. That was my first thought. The second thought was that one of the interesting things about a shelter is that it's not really an enclosure. It doesn't separate an inside world from an outside world. And it made me think about the world in a different way. That we often think of the world as this enormous space that is full of all sorts of things. But what if we thought of the world instead as what I would like to call a plenum? That is something that is already full already full, but which can be twisted and bent and folded in all sorts of ways to create kinks and creases. And then shelter is like going into a crack, like the insect takes shelter in a crack in the rock. And the crack is a little fold in the ground where things have got twisted and bent, and we're living in shelter in those folds. And then I began to think that there's a very interesting connection between shelters and traps. Because in the trap also, you create a little kind of fold in which something gets caught. The difference between the shelter and the trap is that the trap is laid by outside agencies for you to get caught in. The shelter is something that you lay in order to protect yourself against the outside world. So that I realized that the shelter and the trap are precise opposites of one another. And then I was thinking about surfaces. And this is something I have been working on in the last few months. It's interesting that the topic of surfaces, which has long been ignored, has suddenly become of great interest in a number of disciplines across the arts and humanities, in anthropology, but also in literary studies, in architecture, in human geography, and maybe other fields, maybe in archaeology as well. And this is because in the past we distrusted surfaces because we equated the surface with the superficial. It's sort of something that's covering up. If we really want to understand things, we have to get beneath the surface, we thought. And that's part of a discourse of modernity, according to which the mind is inside, knowledge is inside things. We have to break through the surfaces in order to reveal things, true knowledge that is deeper down. One of the things that has happened in all of these disciplines is to question those ideas and to say that no, perhaps what we really need to be looking at is the surface itself. Look at people's faces and you'll find out who they are. You don't have to suppose that who they really are is somewhere deep inside. You can see people from their faces. You can see nature by looking at the kinds of surface textures that there are. And so I became extremely interested in understanding the ground as a particular kind of surface. And instead of thinking of it as the ground, as an interface with the earth underneath and the air on top, and the ground linking the two, I began to think of the ground as what some people have called a deep surface, which doesn't separate earth here and sky there, but actually is where they come together. It's where the constitutive properties of the earth, the growing forth of vegetation and everything coming up, meets the erosive power of the air and the weather coming down. And so there's this interesting ambiguity about the surface of the ground, that it both covers the earth, but it also reveals the earth. In English, we have this word where, and I'm not sure if this is a problem of translation here, because they certainly don't have an equivalent in French to where. So I'm wearing this jumper, right? We also see people that they're wearing a particular expression. And we also say that when something is used up, used a lot, it is worn. So wear has these two meanings of covering and of use and erosion. And it's precisely that double meaning that I think is constitutive of the ground. That makes the ground as a surface different from as the kind of surface that covers up. So there's covering and there's covering up. And I got interested in the phenomenon, in relation to shelter, in the phenomenon of camouflage. Animals use camouflage so that they're not visible to predators, but also the military uses camouflage to hide its tanks. It covers the tanks with a material which looks a bit like vegetation. or if you're flying ahead. And people who are looking for shelter sometimes use camouflage as a way of hiding in the landscape so that they're not seen. And the rest of camouflage is based on precisely this trick of turning one kind of surface into another. Because the camouflage is actually a material, you can lift it up, but it's made to look like the ground, which is this other kind of surface. So I got interested in, these are things that I've been thinking about. Just before starting to write this essay about shelter, I was writing another thing, which emerged out of a workshop that some colleagues and I held recently in Aberdeen, and it was about actually solidity and fluidity, and the problem of the distinction between them and its implications for life in the Anthropocene. During the discussion, it was a little workshop, and with a group of very like-minded colleagues around the table. So there were anthropologists, archaeologists, philosophers, people from science studies, a historian, and we were thinking, because we were talking about the Anthropocene and about geomorphological processes, we wondered at one point, what would happen if, seated in our midst, were some seismologists, meteorologists, hydrologists, real scientists who know about these areas, what would they have to say? And then one of us said, you know, the thing is, we are all amateurs, and we should be proud of it. We should, in fact, think that scholarship of the kind we do and of the kind we need is fundamentally an amateur activity and not a professional one. Now, to start off, that looks strange because, you know, there's at the moment we're living in a populist moment in which experts are considered to be talking bullshit, and you know, we should. But then I thought, yes, we can all be amateurs. The thing about amateurs is two things. Firstly, there are people who study something for the love of it. Amateur comes from love. So an amateur is somebody who studies something for the love of it and is studying it as part of their life and not as a means to advance a career. So for the professional, you're going through, you're building up your degrees, you're getting your publications, you're building a career, you have a position to defend, you're part of the war, of the battle of academia. The amateur says, I'm not interested in any of that. I'm studying this, what I'm studying, because I love it, and it's part of my life, and I cannot therefore distinguish my study from my life. That is what it means to be an amateur. I thought, right, scholars should be amateurs, but we have to combine it in order not to fall for the populist trap of anti-elitist experts. We have to combine amateurism with something I call rigor. But then a colleague of mine, in another sort, said, looked up rigor. You were talking about mathematical rigor. And you looked up rigor in the etymological dictionary. And the words that came out were stiff, dead, rigor mortis, the stiffness, the inflexibility, the severity, the cruelty of and death. And my colleague was saying, you don't know that. And then I realized that there are two kinds of rigor. There is that sort of rigor, which is the rigor of strict analysis, which cuts things up. And then there's the rigor of animacy, a kind of rigor in which it's a matter of being close, of watching and attuning oneself to what is going on.